Welcome to News from Neptune for the anti-penultimate week of 2018, December 14th. I'm Carl Estabrook. I've been charged with not giving a clear date for each program. People have trouble looking at the recorded programs and figuring out when they were recorded. So I wanted to make sure that we pointed out this was in the next to last week of 2018. The 14th of December. And I've put in front of my computer here the calendar of photographs by John Ruskin from the middle of the 19th century of Venice to remind us also of what day it is. Our program is conceived in the spirit of Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a social democratic government a century ago, who said the most revolutionary thing you can do is always to proclaim boldly what is happening. That begins by calling things by the right name, particularly in regard to socialism and capitalism. Our mentor, Noam Chomsky, says terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared by the 1920s. Every industrial society is one form or another of state capitalism. Close quote. That doesn't deny the state capitalist regimes that called themselves socialists made immense strides in the 20th century, in Russia and in China, for example. Since the last decade of that century, our program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, done in the spirit of Noam Chomsky, who turned 90 last week. Our program was first on a community radio station and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube, and earlier editions of this program with dates are available at archive.org. Chomsky says that the U.S. media either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things on a Missing the Point edition of News from Neptune. I don't always warn David what I'm using for a title, and I'll try to explain what I had in mind here briefly. The immense nonsense about Trump all week goes on while the U.S. wars and war threats continue, and the worldwide populist wave continues. But that's not what we hear in the news. This is News from Neptune, where we try to say things that are not heard in the mainstream media. You want to start, David?
Well, okay. Let's dispense with George H.W. Bush, or not dispense, but let's briefly pass over.
Hear, hear.
No pun intended. George H.W. Bush, left over from last week when we didn't do a program.
Well, he's briefly passed over himself, right?
Yes, right. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, much can be said, much has been said from a critical perspective on how predictably bad the mainstream media's response was to the death of this awful man. So, just to pick something relatively at random, Greg Grandin, the Latin American historian, writing in The Nation, writes, "The single most important through line in Bush's life is the way the extension of the national security state and easy recourse to political violence in the world's poorer, darker precincts allowed Anglo-Saxon men like Bush to stem the decomposition and to sharpen their class status consciousness. Raised in the shadow of legends of a father, Prescott Bush, and two grandfathers, Samuel Bush and George H. Walker, who helped steer the expansive, epic era of Episcopalian capitalism, when American industry and politics had become interlocked with militarism. George H.W. Bush came into his own during the glory days of covert action in the Third World. This period, this period ran from, say, the 1953 overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran through the Guatemala coup in 1954, and the Cuban Revolution in 1959. to the assassination of Congolese leader Patrice Lumumba in the Bay of Pigs in 1961, until the eve of escalation in Vietnam. There's always been speculation about whether George H.W. Bush was already a CIA asset even before he entered politics in the early 1960s. But what's also impressed me about his background, that is perhaps a little trivial but needs to be commented on, I think, is that he was basically appointed from the ruling class to lead this country. He never merited, I mean, merit has its problems. He never merited from his political successes, which were mostly failures, the opportunity to become vice president under Reagan, and therefore to become president to become president in 1989 against a weak Democratic Party candidate, Michael Dukakis. But Bush, in spite of all the nonsense about his resume, being appointed for relatively brief periods of time to head the CIA, to be ambassador to China, to be ambassador to the United Nations, and so forth. All these things were ways of just burnishing his credibility to represent the sort of East Coast establishment, even though he had relocated to Texas, to represent the kind of the lineage of the Dulles brothers and the other people who guided this country into the Cold War after World War II, and created this kind of aura that America was entitled to rule the world by force. So that's my little brief take on George H.W. Bush. Much more could be said, of course.
A fitting memorial, I think, for G.H.W. Bush, and it's unfortunate that his career was so lionized in his passing from it. Nothing in his career so became him as his departure, and that was wrong too. The Episcopalian capitalism is an interesting phrase.
I had a feeling we might like to unpack that a little bit.
Well, it could be unpacked in various important ways. It talks about the class background of the U.S. and of the CIA, for that matter, which is all true. I mean, the CIA, in all those years in which it had such an influence in American policy as it does today, and that can be overstated. I remember hearing Phil Agee say, the man who wrote the first major book exposing the crimes of the CIA, and I'm happy to say that I had a chance to meet him when he returned to the United States briefly in the late 70s. Phil Agee used to say that don't make the mistake that the CIA is an independent operation. It's not. It's part of the governmental structure of each presidential administration. Now, that was Agee talking in the late 70s, and is probably still true, as much as the peculiar configuration of American politics right now, or the American administration right now, suggests that the permanent government, the ongoing structure of the American government, is actively working against the current president. I think we shouldn't ignore the extent to which I try to avoid the term deep state, but if by deep state you mean that particular structure of that ongoing structure of American government, it's clear that that deep state, dominated by the neocons right now, is working strenuously, almost hysterically, I'll strike the almost, hysterically, to remove or to at least neutralize President Trump. And one has to ask why. Why has the CIA, the tool of the presidency, in Phil Agee's view a generation ago, why has that now become the center of an attempt, in fact, to topple an American president? Because that's really what they're talking about. That's what they're trying to do. If there is a coup in the United States anytime soon, my suggestion is that it will be led by John Brennan, the former head of the CIA and inveterate foe of Donald Trump. What's going on here? How has this happened? I have a brief explanation, and I'll see if David will buy it. The brief explanation is that Trump really said some things that frightened the American political establishment, Episcopalian capitalism, if you like, to its very bones in the last, and that's not a metaphor, I'm afraid, in the last presidential campaign. Trump suggested that the ongoing political policy, the ongoing foreign policy of the United States, which the CIA is the effective tool of, that policy should be changed. That the American attempt to use war and the threats of war to constrain what Zbigniew Brzezinski called peer competitors, that is, countries that might become equal to the United States in political, military, and mainly economic activity around the world, that the attempt to Trump's suggestion that he could do deals with Russia and China really profoundly frightened the American permanent government and the policy it had been following literally for a century. And I don't think we quite understand what's going on in the American government unless we recognize how deeply shaken that permanent government was by the sorts of things Trump said. When I make this point, people say, but look what Trump's done. Trump's in office has fallen in with the permanent government, fallen in with the American foreign policy as it existed for a century. Minor businesses, important as they may be, such as the rapprochement with North Korea, don't really change the fact that the neocons are still in charge, in spite of what Trump says. And people like Brennan represent that. But people like Brennan are desperately afraid that Trump might mean what he said, and that these policies, which are revealed to be so intimately connected with the ascendancy of the American permanent government, these policies might be shaken a bit by this man Trump. He's off the reservation. He's a loose cannon. He's dangerous. And the possibility of engendering support for those policies by attacking Trump suggested itself early on to the war party, to the neocons, to the permanent government, and that's what we're in the midst of right now. They're doing quite a remarkable job of it. I'm astonished at how much they can get things doing on this matter. Look at the case of Maria Butina in Washington. Astonishing. But that's the fight that's going on in American politics. That's why I say that our concern today is a matter of missing the point, because when we are convinced to spend our time worrying about President Trump's affairs, the wars, the killing, the devastation around the world that the United States is responsible for, that goes on, that continues. And there are interesting counters to it these days, including the worldwide populist revolt, which Trump himself represents. So the war party may have some reason to be worried. I certainly hope so.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any real pushback to that, except to say that, as you already said, but what I would have said if you hadn't said it first was that they are Trump. What's the big deal? Trump is doing the bidding of the ruling class and the deep state and all that sort of stuff right now. He seems to have been well defanged from any threat that he may have posed, that he hypothetically may have posed based on stuff he says. The only other thing I would add to that would have to do with just Democratic Party politics or 2020 presidential politics that may be motivating Democrats to continue to keep Trump's foibles on the front pages, or motivating the liberals at the New York Times and Washington Post to want to keep Trump's foibles on the front page as precedent to hoping that he loses in 2020, or getting him out of there because they're afraid he's going to win, and that no other candidate that he is perhaps the only Republican candidate who could win in 2020, and so it would be better if he stepped aside and the Democratic Party had a clear shot at whoever else would be running, and that's motivated further by the Democratic takeover of the House and having to give all these committees something to do other than the things that the American people want done.
And I think the important point to recognize as the background or the reason for so much of the American permanent government's hysteria at the moment is that Trump is not just one semi-comic figure on the American political stage. He represents this suppressed populist movement that every now and then we hear establishment figures threaten us with. After all, don't you know those populists are fascists and we've got to stop fascism? That's not so. What happens is that, as the Gilets jaunes in Paris show, this populist movement, this movement against the worldwide elite dominated by the American 1%, this populist movement is serious and it's worldwide, and it's making a difference. And the American ruling class, which isn't stupid, they're vicious, that's different. The American ruling class understands that this is a real challenge to them. This sort of challenge that they haven't really faced in a long time, a challenge that goes back, that they haven't faced since before the Second World War, a challenge which required the Second World War for them to defeat the first time. Great Depression, remember, ended not because of the New Deal, important as it was, but because of the reorganization of worldwide capitalism by the U.S. In the course of the Second World War, where, of course, we had to destroy a lot of it in order to get control of it. Now, given that situation, given the real threat to the ascendancy of the American ruling class, they know that even a clownish figure like Trump, since he represents some of that threat, can be weaponized by the worldwide populism against them. And they're scared of him for that reason, not because of any of his talents, but because of what he does, in fact, represent.
Yeah, this might be an interesting time to sort of segue into the consideration of the Gilets jaunes.
Yellow jackets is the translation that I like best for that.
They're pronouncing it Gilets jaunes.
Gilets
jaunes, I think.
Gilets jaunes.
Gilets jaunes. Okay.
Gilets jaunes.
Anyway, I mean, a lot.
Pardon our French.
Some good reporting on it on left-wing websites. I forget where I found this article, but I thought it was kind of a good pithy statement to read about this. An article called "From Sans-Culottes to Gilets jaunes: Macron's Marie Antoinette moment," and it was written by someone named Sylvain Cypel, C-Y-P-E-L. I forget what website. I don't think it was Counterpunch. I think it was something that I probably was referred to from the Marx mail list. And she writes the following opening two paragraphs. In Soviet times, Russia's Jews told a joke about a man named Rabinovich, who was distributing pamphlets in Red Square. In a matter of minutes, the KGB found him and took him to headquarters. Only there did agents realize that the sheets of paper were completely blank. Quote, "But there's nothing here, there's nothing written here," one of them said. Ravinovich said, quote, "They know quite well what I mean."
I like that.
I thought you would. And then the next paragraph that Sylvain Sipel, C-Y-P-E-L, writes is, "For 2 months, the French government has been unable to make head or tail of the blank sheets of paper handed out by the Gilets jaunes, or Yellow Vests, this decentralized, leaderless movement that has no explicit agenda or demand apart from the abolition of a fuel tax, while Emmanuel Macron's government has blindly concluded that this sudden violent movement, bereft of any clearly articulated purpose, has no other goals. Movements don't block intersections just to protest hikes in gas costs."
Yep. I think that's right. And I think that's close to the point that I was hoping to make by calling today's program an exercise in missing the point. It's not an accident. The American ruling class and its agents in the American government, media, are working very hard to make sure that people do miss the point being the opposition to the worldwide economic and military control of the American ascendancy. There can't really be an argument about that from the point of view of the American 1%, because they know if there is a public argument about it, they'll lose. Therefore, they have to make sure the argument is about something else, like Trump's hair or his mistresses or something like that. Because if it really were about how the country was being run and in whose interest the country was being run and why we're killing people around the world, that would be very different. That would be very dangerous to the ascendancy. They'd lose that argument because people, in fact, do know perfectly well what they mean. And it's that threat that the American permanent government is trying to fend off right now. One of its methods, not the only one, is the Russian hysteria.
Yeah. The important economic researcher is Thomas Piketty, who's, I'm sure, having a good time in France right now, and Emmanuel Says and Gabriel Zuckman out of Berkeley, who also a place to have a good time. They keep coming out with reports about national income, national wealth, global income, global wealth. They're working very hard to keep us updated on what these vast radical disparities are between a few people and almost everyone else on a global scale, and especially in this country. And I keep looking back at this data that's been coming out for the last 2 or 3 years, or it's been coming out for many years, but the most updated versions, and trying to think how can one summarize what's happened to our country, to our economy, to our working class in the last 40 years. A lot of this data starts in about 1980 and then the most recently goes up to like 2014. Even though the reports didn't come out till, this particular report I refer to didn't come out till 2016. And one way of looking at this to really, I think, help us understand this is that the bottom 50% of adults, the incomes, adults meaning everyone, not just people who may or may not be working, but the income of the bottom 50% of adults in that period of 1980 through 2014 lost 7% of its share of national income, the manner in which they figured this out. And they figure it out in various ways, including post-tax, including all of the taxation and then transfers of wealth, accounting for every dollar of the currently $20 trillion GDP in forms of income. Well, what that 7% means in terms of current dollars is that every adult, all of those something like 120 million adults in that bottom 50%, would have been making $11,000 more per year in income if they had just maintained, if their incomes had grown the manner in which the GDP had grown. In other words, if it had grown 60% instead of 20%, which is what it grew for the bottom 50%. Meanwhile, that same 7%, if one looks at it this way, and it's fair to look at it this way, went to the upper 1%. So what that means is that you take $11,000 for each of those 50 people in the bottom 50%, pool that, you make $550,000, and you give it to one person in the 1%. That's how radical these changes, these policies, all of this being driven by policies, by trade policies, by tax policies, by social program policies, all of these things driven by policies, which means that every one of those bottom 50 people, who certainly that bottom 50% does the majority of the labor, as Marx defined it, in this country, every one of those bottom 50% of people loses $11,000, and every one of those 1% people, each one of those people makes $550,000 more than they would have made if their incomes had simply grown that 60% over that 35-year period or so between 1980 and 2014. This is how radical these changes are, and this is why one wonders, when I started doing this research is because I was wanting to explain to people, they know quite well what I mean when people vote for Trump. They know quite well what I mean. It's not just about we don't like immigrants and we don't like black people. These white people, these few white people in these few counties in these few states who were important in putting Trump into office. These are things that we need to understand.
And it's important to note here, I think, two aspects of the situation David describes. First, that it's not an accident. It's a policy. The policy is called neoliberalism, and it is a conscious policy, a policy that the American upper class, the American business class, instituted when it became afraid that the democratizing movement of the anti-Vietnam War times would produce a criticism of the economic situation that the U.S. found itself in, which indeed it did. But the counterattack was quite severe, and the counterattack, quite conscious as well, as neoliberalism, the rights of capital being asserted over against the majority, drove wages down, as David describes, and increased inequality in America over the last 40 years in an accelerating fashion. It didn't just increase inequality at the same rate, it increased inequality at an increasing rate. The second derivative was positive. Now this situation is recognized by Americans, and this is the second point, is recognized by Americans who may not be able to quote the numbers that David was just summarizing, but they know what's happening in their lives. They know what's happening to their life chances. They know what's happening to their prosperity as compared to that of their parents. That's what elected Donald Trump. That's what produces the Yellow Jackets in France. That's what produces the objection to the Tory regime in Britain, the Brexit movement in Britain is a demand that these neoliberal policies be reversed. The neoliberal policies that the Tory government in Britain presided over are recognized by the British majority as being against their interests. The same thing is happening in the other advanced capitalist democracies. I use the term of art, not an adequate description. And we're seeing this around the world, and the people who recognize most clearly that this is happening are the American ascendancy, the American ruling class, and they're moving against it. They're working against it. That's why there are riots in France right now. That's why there are large popular support for Donald Trump in the United States, in spite of what the mainstream movement, the mainstream media tell you. And that's why the situation in the other, well, I like the term that's been used by Pepe Escobar, the Brazilian-American commentator on these matters. He speaks of FUKUS, France, the UK, and the United States. Yes, exactly. France, the UK, and the United States are not only conducting, are not only killing people around the world in military operations, they are also working strenuously to prevent this populist uprising, to challenge the rulers in each of those communities. So, what's happening in France is that the exercise in missing the point that is being encouraged so much in the United States, Britain, and France is coming apart. The point is being understood, however incoherently, by large numbers of people in all these societies who know what is happening in their lives. And the struggle is not over. The struggle is growing. And the people who recognize that most clearly are people in charge of this society. The story is not over by any means.
I think what's missing and what's conscious, sort of intentionally but unconsciously missing from the manner in which these things are analyzed in the mainstream media, the New York Times and so forth, is that capitalist relations are social relations, that the relationships among wealth and income are reproduced socially, and they have to be. They're not just about wealth and income, they're about power. And people have to go out of the way to miss the point that people understand when the educated classes, when the highly educated classes try to explain to people what's happening to their jobs, what's happening with trade, what's happening with neoliberalism, why is it that technological progress, quote unquote progress, seems to not make your lives better? Educated people keep trying to explain why this happens, and the quote unquote uneducated people sort of keep not getting it. And one example of this, I think, is the manner in which Thomas Edsall, the wonky columnist in the New York Times, handles these issues. He talks to a lot of well-informed people who have a lot of technical perspectives on jobs and so-called technological progress, but he could never ever get to the point that these things are happening because that's the way the system works, that there's not some sort of technical fix other than changing the system in a kind of radical way. In his most recent column yesterday, he does exactly this. The title of it is "The Robots Have Descended on Trump Country." You can almost get the idea of what it's going to be. We're going to talk about robots. We're going to talk about technological progress. We're going to talk about why it is that Trump voters have gotten the short end of the stick, but don't really understand why, and they vote for Trump against their interests and so forth. And Thomas Edsall even goes so far in this column as to quote the great British Marxist historian E.P. Thompson, author of The Making of the English Working Class, who described the brutality of economic transformation during the industrial revolution in Britain. And so quotes Thompson as in the following way: the experience of immiseration came upon them in 100 different forms, For the field laborer, the loss of his common rights and the vestiges of village democracy. For the artisan, the loss of his craftsman's status. For the weaver, the loss of livelihood and of independence. For the child, the loss of work and play in the home. For many groups of workers whose real earnings improved, the loss of security, leisure, and the deterioration of the urban environment. End quote. And then Edsel goes on to say, on the basis of this quote, while there are parallels between conditions of workers during industrialization in England and during the deindustrialization of regions of this country now, one big difference stands out from a political vantage point. In England, workers turn sharply to the left, while here, they have moved sharply to the right. Meaning in Edsel's world, I agree with your hand motions. In Edsel's world, we always have to get back to these stupid Trump voters, to these stupid people whose lives aren't the same or who aren't having the expected outcomes in their lives. We have to get back to sort of analyzing them and why they don't get what the British. Now you could talk about whether the British electorate, Britain has gone obviously the same way as this country from Thatcher and Reagan forward. So that doesn't apply now. And the New York Times isn't exactly writing in glowing terms about Jeremy Corbyn, and Thomas Edsel, as far as I know, isn't writing columns favoring Jeremy Corbyn, whereas other people are writing columns about what an anti-Semite he is. But beyond that, there isn't any effort by Edsel to really go a little more deeply into understanding what it is. He quotes a lot of people in this column, Jeffrey Sachs and other people like that, saying halfway decent things, but it's not just a technological problem. The focus is on what do you do about these robots? How are people going to work when their jobs are being taken by these robots? Their jobs are being automated. That shouldn't be that difficult if people shared in the wealth of what technological progress had to offer. That would be a problem. But in capitalism, everything has to be about jobs and wages and exploitation and surplus value. And Thomas Edsel, even though he quotes a Marxist, can't see beyond that. And if he did see beyond that, he wouldn't be writing a column in the New York Times.
There is another problem here in the language we use to discuss this. I've said for a while, and not much agreement, I must admit, that we simply should abandon the terms left and right because they are so corrupted by discussions by people like Edsel that they're essentially useless. If it would be far more beneficial to substitute the terms elitist and populist for right and left, and we would come closer to the an accurate description of political views of not equal halves of the populace at all, but remarkably unequal halves, a small ruling class, a small elitist ruling class, and a large populist insurgency that is often inchoate in terms of expressing exactly what it wants and why it wants it. It simply knows, as you were suggesting, quoting E.P. Thompson, that things have changed in their disfavor, and that someone is doing it to them, and that they are open to understanding the situation, and that makes for a political discussion in which missing the point is what the elites want. They don't want people to see the sort of situation that David was just describing that will lead to a transformation of the conditions of life in modern industrial capitalist society. But that's happening. It's coming, and it can take some peculiar forms, like Donald Trump. But the fact of the matter is that we're talking about a larger movement than that, as the elites very well understand. It's not just one dangerous politician who has to be suppressed. We're talking about a movement, indeed a worldwide movement here, in which the American ascendancy's attempt to maintain the disparity, as it understood it had to do after the Second World War, to maintain the disparity is becoming more and more difficult. And that's what the riots in France are about. That's what the extension of the populist movement around the world is about, maintaining the disparity in the benefit of the elite, a disparity which, as David pointed out too, has been growing remarkably over the last generation and more. That's not going to be possible. And the transformation may be quite painful for many people. We could do best by understanding what it is and what's happening, and trying to make sure that the forces of order, in quotes, are unable to maintain the order that they are presently defending.
Yeah, since the rise of the Gilets jaunes movement, there's been, in the mainstream media, there's been good coverage of it, plenty of good articles on Counterpunch and elsewhere, talking about it in various terms, like this brief one I referred to by Sylvain Seipel. But there's in the mainstream media, what you have is an extraordinary amount of sort of policing of language in terms of left and right as to what it is this movement really is,
yes,
because they're flummoxed by the idea that these rural people, these quote-unquote uneducated people are doing this, but they've been forced to acknowledge that this just isn't the racist element in France. This just isn't the, Marine Le Pen element.
Well,
right. I mean, I'm sorry, but that's what the boundary policing is all about. That they haven't been able anyway to reduce this to a simply Trumpian type movement, what they see as a Trumpian type movement. So, but they're still making extraordinary efforts to get us to think in terms of who these people are in relation to the real leftists and the real racists and the real fascists and all these people, without and they're still forced to look at this and say that it's just the people.
Yes.
The people. I mean, not all of the people, but the real people, the people who do the work.
And that exercise in encouraging people to miss the point was what was at stake in Hillary Clinton's her attack on the deplorables in the last election campaign. People who are objecting had to be understood as deplorable racists and others who simply don't realize how important it is to get with the program of neoliberalism that the American ruling class had been following for more than a generation. That's the issue, and that's the attempt to define the issue that the American chattering classes have been so busy at for a generation. And that's what we should understand and admire, perhaps, the presumption of some of the more outrageous attempts to make that point, or to insist people miss the point. I have in mind the whole Russiagate business. This is incredible. This is just remarkable. The notion that these things are being done by the government of Russia that somehow stole the election in the United States. That if you were writing comedy, you might suggest a plot like this, but any reasonable producer would say, that's too fantastic. You can't suggest something like that. People would laugh. Well, in fact, some people are laughing, but there's a serious attempt to make sure that people don't laugh at this notion that the Russians are behind whatever troubles the American ruling class faces at home or abroad. It's quite astonishing that such a thing has worked as well. Do we have time for me to read a little of C.J. Hopkins here?
Yeah. I mean, I think you read that is it the same thing?
Yeah, it's on my mind. I think what I'll do, I'll put it on the Facebook page for News from Neptune, because it is one of the few attempts to realize that there is a dark comedy going on here, and to treat it in terms of dark comedy.
Right. So go.
Yeah, go ahead. I think we should move on. There are plenty of other things to be said about it.
We did talk about that a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
So I think, stuff keeps coming up along those lines. Paul Street keeps.
Paul.
Reminding us that this Trump and left is actually a thing, and but anyway, I would just conclude. I maybe have something that Dr. No offered, but to relate to this, to what we just been talking about, I wanted to note an article that was on this morning's Counterpunch by our friend Rich Whitney down in Carbondale,
oh, yes.
Green Party former gubernatorial candidate. He wrote a nice article called "General Motors factories should not be closed; they should be turned over to workers."
There we go.
And that's along. I've seen a couple of other notes along these lines, and one would one would hope, if one were to fantasize about what would set off the kind of in a perhaps more constructive way than simply opposing gas taxes, petrol taxes, as in France, the closure, the announced closure of these General Motors plants, which was obviously timed to be, what was the timing that had to do with that? Something to do with after Trump did something or whatever. But anyway, and also I think Leo Panitch has talked about this. I forget what it was on the Real News or on one of the podcasts I listened to in terms of Canada. This should be seen as an opportunity, as a more constructive opportunity to respond to what neoliberalism is continuing to do.
Remember, in the Obama administration, there was a chance for the U.S. to nationalize the automobile industry, or good parts of it, and turn it into a national transportation program that would substitute mass transit for the individual automobiles that are choking the planet right now. The Obama administration really did have a chance to do that because GM fell on hard times and was about to go bankrupt. Instead of taking it over and running it in the public interest, the Obama administration restored the fortunes of the GM shareholders by bailing them out and reestablishing the company on the same basis, but now with a lot of government money guaranteed to support the value of the stock of the former owners and the once and future owners, the continuing owners. We can do these things. They would have been possible, but we didn't have a government that was willing to do it because that government was working for the 1%, not for the majority of people whose interests would be served by a transportation system that really was based on mass transit. These questions are not technical. They're not hard. They're straightforward. They have to do with what it is that we want as a society and what we can do for the society as a whole rather than for the profits of the 1%. But the Obama administration, of course, chose the latter.
Yeah. So, where to go with this?
Can I say a word about
sure.
something you started with?
Yeah, sure.
The notion of episcopal capitalism was well put because it taught about this the cultural and political and economic construction that produced G.H.W. Bush, but because it taps into other themes, it put me in mind of an article this last week from the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams. He pointed out that this argument about Brexit in Britain is really an argument about the anti-social policies followed by the Tory government in Britain. The government in Britain did similar things to the Obama government in this country. That is, it worked for the well-to-do, for the rich, for the 1%, and immiserated the majority. That was in some sense more obvious in Britain than it was here. Obama was better at covering his tracks than David Cameron was, for example, and it was the same was true in France, where Macron was not quite so good about covering the tracks of the 1% there, even though he pretended to be following a progressive policy. Notice something similar between the Obama and Macron regimes. The fact of the matter was that in each case, people saw through what was going on, and some opposition developed that was beyond the standard comfortable left and right divisions. So long as you get people thinking in left and right terms, and they say, well, the left won 52% of the House seats and the right only had 48%, and this is a victory for progressivism. This is nonsense, of course, because it's a setup. It's a complete way to maintain the current situation by pretending that there is a real debate going on. What the populist upsurges in the U.S. and France and Britain suggest is that a real debate is breaking out. And that's the debate that scares our leaders, that scares our rulers, that scares the agents of the 1%. And the reason that things are proceeding as they are, both in Paris and in Washington.
What I was going to say, what just left me for a second there, there's a lot of debate going on now, at least among certain precincts, about the Green New Deal, what it is, what the promises of it are, whether it's a thing, whether it's a ploy by the progressive Democrats to kind of move to the left without really moving left, whether it's genuinely moving towards socialism, whether it's something the socialists should support. I'm not sure if it's even well understood whether the Green New Deal is whether the word green refers to the Green Party, or whether these kind of ideas originated in the Green Party, or whether it's simply the environmental program. It's mainly the latter, and whether I associate it with I think Robert Pollin at Perry, the Political Economy Research Institute at UMass Amherst, which is fine. It's basically a sort of a Keynesian think tank. And so what they evoke here, of course, in their Keynesian way is the kind of New Deal, the kind of FDR programs that began to revitalize the economy, or at least provided some precedent for revitalizing the economy with massive social spending back in the 1930s. But the question has evolved into whether this is something that people can really hang their hats on moving forward, whether the newly progressive members of Congress, those few members, really should promote this and what it stands for. And a lot of these, there's a little, again, sort of boundary policing issues here in relation to what that really means or might not mean, and then that engenders debates over what Roosevelt's New Deal really was about saving capitalism and all that stuff. So that's a whole can of worms that's been opened up by this. But again, there are practical matters here that need to be dealt with, but that should only be dealt with in a context of socialism. That's the question, whether the Green New Deal has anything to say about socialism, and because that's all that's really going to move us forward.
There's a principle in Confucianism, as I recall from my very faint knowledge of the subject, called the rectification of names. And that means that confusions about names and social roles should be recognized, and the appropriate roles should be taken up. Fathers should become fathers. Rulers should become rulers. It seems to me that we need a rectification of names for an awful lot of political discussion in this country. Left and right are names that need to be rectified, that need to be understood and applied more accurately, because there's a conscious attempt to miss the point of what those names actually mean. When our senior senator in Illinois is referred to as a left or progressive Democrat, we've gotten far, far away from the proper rectification of names. And the reason has been suggested that we need to go away from, get away from talking about left and right is that it doesn't work anymore. Those names have to be rectified. We have to try to find another way describing accurately the proposals and, more importantly, the situation that we find ourselves in. That seems to me to be absolutely required to make any progress along those lines. The fact that we live in the world's greatest propaganda system, that's what the United States has really contributed in the last several generations, makes it very difficult to do this job. If you can't call things by their right names, it's rather hard to talk about them.
One of the many good articles about, in observance of Noam Chomsky's 90th birthday, just one that came out this morning on Counterpunch, was an interview with Richard Falk, who has the international lawyer Richard Falk, who's had an extensive relationship with Chomsky for many decades. I recommend that, among many other things. Let me just read one quote here that really gets us to the issue of what the social relations of capitalism are, that Rich Whitney referred to in his article. He writes, "Perhaps the time has come for the nascent movement in the United States for genuine socialism, i.e. for democratic workers' control over the means of production, to use the prospect of closed factories and ruined communities in Lordstown, Ohio, Baltimore, Maryland, and Detroit Hamtramck. How do you say that? Hamtramck, Oshawa, which is in Canada, and Warren, Michigan, to organize a new manifestation of the Occupy movement. Only this time it could be an Occupy movement that would go beyond occupying public spaces and start using legal and political mechanisms to occupy, own, operate, and transform real facilities of production with a view toward building genuine socialism."
You've been watching
Rich Whitney.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the anti-penultimate week of 2018, on the 14th of December, a Missing the Point edition. Tomorrow there will be a demonstration at 5 p.m. in downtown Champaign at Main and Neal Streets in sympathy with and solidarity with the Yellow Jackets, the French movement, the French populist movement. 5 p.m., Main and Neal.
It's Saturday, tomorrow, Saturday.
Yes.
Just in case people might be watching this on Saturday.
Exactly. We recommend the group who put this together include a number of local political groups, and it should be worthwhile. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, with research by J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young, with Andrew Scolleroy. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.